Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation today. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's what I know. Our lives are made up of stories. The stories we live and the stories we tell, but also all those other stories in between that we don't get to share or we don't get to hear for whatever reason. Each of these stories shapes us, whether they are being told or not. The stories that we tell or don't tell help us to know what we're allowed to feel and what life can be like for us. We learn and we pass on ideas and values and meaning through our stories. And we have choices about the stories that we choose to tell ourselves and the meaning we create around those stories. Today, I am excited to have you join me in this conversation with Rebekah Taussig. Among many other things, Rebekah is the author of the book Sitting Pretty, The View from My Ordinary, Resilient, Disabled Body, which is how I first became familiar with Rebekah. I swear her book jumped off the shelf at the library and right into my hands, and I read it, and now here we are. I was really excited to have this conversation with Rebekah, and let me tell you, she did not disappoint. If you had had a chance to listen to any of my other conversations, I think it will become clear to you, as it did for me, just how CMM-ish Rebekah is. She really embodies the best part of the CMM theory. And I think she has a lot of meaningful things to say about the power of story in her own life that we could all certainly stand to learn from too. So I don't want to make us wait any longer. Let's jump in with Rebekah.
Hi, Rebekah. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm really thrilled to be here. I could not be more excited about this conversation.
I'm so excited to get to hear more about your story, your perspective, and all of the things that I think we are going to relate on about storytelling and all of it. To start, I'd love to ask you to introduce yourself by sharing some stories about you that might be helpful for us to know about you as we go into this conversation, stories that help us understand who you are.
Yeah, I love that as an introductory question. Normally it's like, what is your bio? But this is great. This is great. I mean, I think when I think about storytelling that has shaped me in one way or another, I mean, a lot of it has to do with a lack of storytelling or an erasure from storytelling. So like growing up using a wheelchair, I became paralyzed around the age of 3. And so I used a wheelchair I have used a wheelchair for the vast majority of my life. And growing up, as you like kind of look out at the world around you and try to make sense of what this place is about and how you fit into it. For the most part, there was just sort of a giant lack of storytelling that included anyone that looked like me or moved like me or had a story like me. So I think in a lot of ways, the lack of stories, was a big part of how I came to think about myself and imagine my future. It's strange and difficult to articulate to people who maybe don't have that experience of like almost a sweeping erasure from representation. But I had a really difficult time imagining myself as an adult. And I've talked with a lot of other folks with this, like who grew up with disabilities that have voiced similar things, which was surprising to me.
Interesting.
Yeah. When I heard that from others. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. And one of which might be just that you're immersed in medical spaces that are always pointing out the ways that your body is not working in the way that other bodies are. And so you kind of learn to think that your body is just on the brink of something, I guess. But I think part of it is just not seeing any representation or story or model of what a life of adulthood could look like for you. And so it's sort of assuming I must fall off the edge somewhere. So I think that was part of it for me, but also the representation that would have been there, or the stories that I would have been consuming, which I was an avid consumer of. Like I immersed myself in the world of every kind of storytelling in books and magazines and TV shows and movies. And I grew up in the 90s. So I watched like all of the 90s rom-coms 45 times in a row. And so I did have a lot of pictures of like girlhood and womanhood and like what stories of girls were supposed to be. And for anyone that grew up in the 90s, it's like there was just a flood of stories about weddings and marriage, and it's all like Runaway Bride and My Best Friend's Wedding and Maybe Fat Cake Wedding. And it's like, those are in my mind. I think that I felt like as a girl, there were only so many positive storylines to choose from. And that like getting married and maybe by extension, having a family in my mind felt like the ideal route, but disability never intersected with that path. And so it felt like this impossible double bind of like, I don't know where there's no place for me to fit. And that wasn't just like in fictional storytelling on screens, like in my family. I think that was reinforced in a lot of ways. I'm the youngest of 6 kids, and my parents very much held traditional gender roles in the family. So my dad was like left at 6:30 in the morning with his suit and his briefcase and worked all day at the bank. And then my mom was home with us and like doing all of the cooking, and, you know, her world really was caring for us. And so, and the stories about her life were very much pinned to finding, like, getting married to my dad and having 6 kids. And then all my siblings kind of started to do similar things. And sort of reinforcing that narrative as the ideal path, I guess. And so for me, I didn't fit in so many ways. And I think disability is part of that, and also not, you know, like there's no way to sort of calculate or quantify like how much disability is the thing that made me really different. And therefore all these other different things developed, or if I was always going to be, I was going to say black sheep. I don't know. Black sheep seems to have like a really negative connotation. I was just the different one in a lot of ways, and continue to be. And so I felt really different. Things went differently for me in a lot of ways. And it's taken me a long time to sort of figure out what my story is in contrast to all of that, or to kind of stand on its own. I think for a while it felt like my job was I had to like pull really hard against that story, and that my story sort of almost just developed in opposition to. And so to really sort of settle into like, who is this person, and what do I want, and what path do I want to be on, and what stories do I want to build for myself, and how do I want to tell this story? I guess I should also say, to go back even further in terms of like the stories that shaped me, my parents went through this intense crisis at the beginning of my life, which was like, I was diagnosed with cancer. I was supposed to die. They had lived their entire lives in the Midwest, and suddenly they were like flying with their youngest of 6 kids to New York City to have me operated on. Like, one of the only surgeons in the country that would operate on me. Like, it was a huge thing for them, obviously. And through that time, they really developed stories about me and my life through that time. And I think as a parent, I think the goal of that was both to like cope as a family, but also to empower me. And so when I was really young, my mom and I would like go to schools and speak to these schools about what my story was, which was really my mom's script of what my story was. As it would be at that time. And she even wrote, like, by the time I was maybe 8 or 9, she even wrote a book called Rebekah's Story. That was sort of about me, and the story that my mom and kind of my dad, but mostly my mom, told was that it was very spiritual. It was sort of me as this expression of God's goodness, that like he gave me joy in a circumstance that I shouldn't have had joy in, and that I sort of kind of became this symbol, like this young girl with a paralyzed body sitting in a wheelchair, a hot pink wheelchair, kind of became this like symbol of God's goodness, that he could give me joy despite, kind of thing. And so a lot of like me being a source of inspiration by smiling, that was a story that I grew up trying to fit into.
Yeah.
You know, I guess all of these things are happening at the same time.
Yeah.
So trying to hold on to the weight of that and maintain it and hold it up, and what happens when you don't feel like smiling anymore, and is there any space for that? And so I kind of crumbled underneath that story eventually. Like it imploded, and in
absolutely,
in a pretty big and catastrophic way. Yeah, I guess I would say in terms of like how it worked for me and having this positive story handed to me, given to me as a young person, and trying to match it and fit into it and hold it up and keep it up. I think in the beginning, it maybe it did serve me a bit. Maybe it did sort of give me a place to feel like I fit and something I could contribute to the world. But I think just the disconnect between my actual experience of some of that early medical trauma, I might use the word, and like what I had actually experienced, took a really long time to catch up to me. But of course, like it was all stored in my body. And so what happened for me was I worked very hard to fit into and hold up to that story of being like, basically like, I don't know, the star of my church community. And this sort of symbol of something about the way that God works through sickness, I guess. And I was very involved in church and youth group growing up. I married a guy I knew from youth group that was my high school boyfriend, and it just was bad in every layer. Like it was, and not necessarily because he was like such an awful person at all. I mean, I think it was mostly that I was profoundly disconnected from myself. I mean, I've described like our wedding. I felt like I was watching a movie. I was not even present. I was watching something happen, you know, probably from all of the wedding movies I'd watched growing up, right? Like this is the scene. But pretty soon after we got married, I think that basically my body had put up every red flag and I'd ignored every red flag. And then it just started to shut down. We were not a compatible match. We were not a good match. And we hadn't been before we got married, but after we got married and we were living together for the first time as like early 20 somethings, it was just kind of catastrophic. And I couldn't eat. I like couldn't even drink water. I wasn't sleeping. I was like really falling apart. And so that was kind of the beginning of the sort of breaking up of that story I'd been given and inherited. You know, the landscape was sort of desolate, like decimated and empty. And it was this beginning of like rebuilding. And, you know, I think I'm still doing that.
Absolutely. Aren't we all?
Yeah, as we should be. I think that makes sense. But yeah, I guess that's the beginning of the stories. And hopefully that tells people some things about me. I think that probably tells people maybe even more than they want to know, but that's, that was the beginning.
I think that is a great place to start this conversation. In what I'm hearing when you were talking is kind of generally talking about, here are the stories I inherited on a number of levels, but really emblematic of those is your mom writing Rebekah's story. And specifically the naming of that is so fascinating because it is specifically not your story. It is Rebekah's mom's story.
Yes.
You know, it's from her perspective.
Yeah.
And your stories obviously include the same events.
Yeah.
But you experience them so differently.
Yeah.
And if it really was Rebekah's story and it's was what you would have written about that at that time, which is really probably maybe the other name for your actual book that you have written, Sitting Pretty, is Rebekah's story, you know, parentheses, Rebekah's story, because that was your perspective. And that's just so interesting and valuable, I think, for people to understand like the many, many layers or perspectives that a single story can have.
Yeah.
And I want to dive into my theory a little bit here to kind of show you some other language to say the exact same thing that you're already thinking about. Is that one of the models in CMM is called the Loop model, and that's LUUUUTT.
Okay.
And that's where the name of the podcast comes from, because the L is lived stories and the last T is told stories. And then the U's are for unheard, untold, untellable, unknown. And then the other T is for storytelling, because that's the act. And really those U's could go on forever. There's a lot of other versions that have other U's, but those were kind of the first four. And what we're getting at is that, first of all, there's a difference between the stories we live and the stories we tell.
Yeah.
Because what happens in between those two is that we make meaning out of the things that happen to us. So although literally you and your mom maybe lived the same story, you didn't have the same role in it, but you experienced the same. You were in those doctor's appointments together. You went through everything together. But the stories you would tell about it would be different, which, you know, represents Rebekah's story, and Rebekah's mom's story would be those stories told. And then on a much bigger level, I think what you're talking about is that the stories that were then told to you about what womanhood was, about what adulthood was, you were not hearing stories about what adulthood looked like or what womanhood looked like in a wheelchair. Those were unheard stories for you. And maybe you're saying too, another layer I'll add is that an untellable story for you was maybe the point when you said, well, I don't want to smile anymore. Because there was no space left, maybe once your mom had kind of said, this is the story, this is what it is. There's maybe felt like there wasn't space left for you to say, well, what about this other part of the story that you're not acknowledging?
I think it felt like if I express anything else, I'll ruin the story. Like that story, that story is a beautiful story. And if I don't want to mess it up.
Right.
And so I'll just stuff all of that inside my body and hold on to all of the other parts of this story.
Yeah.
And I do want to be clear. Like I feel like I feel so protective of my mom in these conversations because I think that it has felt, I think there was like a good part of my 20s. I felt very frustrated with her and even bitter about how that went down.
Yeah.
I think it makes so much sense how it happened. I think it makes so much sense how that works. And I think I'm mostly my perspective on that is shifting as I've become a parent, and I just like the overwhelming love that feels like we have to still be connected by major arteries because it feels that way, right? Like I feel like that, and how in her desire to, I can't even imagine the extra layer of the trauma that was happening and the suffering that she was watching in her daughter, and how, of course, all of that was so well intentioned. And I think that's part of what makes it interesting too, is to see like how powerful and subtle storytelling can be, and how we translate that to each other in ways that we're not even aware of. Because she would say, if she was in this conversation with us, she would say, I wanted you to be able to cry. I wanted you to be able to express whatever pain you had. I mean, she did, but the narrative didn't have room for that. The story didn't have room for that. And that ultimately became more powerful than, like what she would have expressed verbally, like, no, tell me if you're sad. It makes me very conscious of thinking about what stories I'm passing on to my kid as well.
It's such a good point, because to use another, kind of communication term of pluralistic truths, is that our stories can all exist at the same time. It's not, there's not one capital T truth that we're all trying to work towards. It's what's true for you about your experience can exist at the same time of me knowing what's true for my experience. And those could be totally opposite things. Yeah. And so it's about, how do we learn to live in this tension, in this complexity of all these stories that exist at the same time? I think of it like, maybe you could appreciate this because it's literally just like, I don't know the right word, like linguistic or grammatical reference. And I know you're an English person, of like, I like the idea of both and.
Yes.
Like literally in a sentence, you would say, I am both tired and hungry. I am both whatever and whatever. And I like that in actual words. And then as like a concept of your mom both loves you and limited you in ways with this story.
Yeah.
You both love your mom and can see how much she cares for you, and can empathize with her now as now you're a mother. And you can still feel those feelings of, wow, I wish that hadn't gone down like that. Yeah. It's the both and of it all. I think a lot of people struggle with that though, because it's really challenging to plant yourself in that gray area, in that tension between those stories. How do I hold both of these in my hands at the same time? Not looking for a right story or a wrong story.
Yes. And it is the only way that makes sense to me. Like it is chaotic and blurry and like wobbly sometimes, but it's the only ground that actually feels sturdy to me, because it is always, I mean, like I have this tattoo on my arm that says this too. And part of that is that idea of like, it's this and it's also this and it's also this too, right? Like it's all of these things at once. It has to be.
It has to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I resonate with that idea of a both and or a this too so much, because for me growing up, the stories that I got were very black and white, right and wrong, good and bad. And then as I go out into the world on my own, I say, well, these experiences that I'm having, this newness that I'm experiencing does not fit neatly into these two piles. And so that is like my journey that I really still feel like I'm unpacking a lot of that. There's still, my instinct is to try to, you know, simplify things down like that. And there's some things you can maybe think that you've simplified down, or you could trick yourself into believing that that fits, but it doesn't. And so, it's just a learning, I guess, of how to exist in that gray, which I don't have the like 5 steps of learning how to be in the tension.
It's interesting. I feel like, I don't know what it's like in other people's brains, but I think because I lived so bound so tightly up in only having a one-note narrative and only letting it be one thing, that being unbound from that or opening up to the multiple stories at once, multiple truths at once, felt so freeing, even though it was also sort of like a tornado of chaos. Like, wait, what? Expanding beyond that one note did feel so liberating to me that I can't imagine going back to any other way of being in the world, really.
Here's where I want to go next, is that, so yes, you've talked about the part of your life which was not hearing any stories that resonated with you or looked like you or showed you what life could be like for you as a person in a wheelchair. You write in your book about when you started to hear those stories, or also when you yourself started to tell those stories and got the response that you did from other people. And so I'd love to hear about what it meant for you when you were able to seek out or stumble across stories where you did start to feel represented, and what that shift was like for you.
Oh my gosh. Okay. We have so much we can talk about here. I mean, like for me, so I went until about the age of 27, not having that. There was like a very pivotal shift for me in graduate school. So I was like 27 or something, I think. And I was like in the first year of a PhD program that I was about to drop out of because it was like the most intense semesters of my life. And I didn't quite know what I was doing it for. I went into graduate school studying 19th century British and American literature, which I loved. I got my master's in 19th century British and American literature. And I loved the time period, and I loved reading and analysis, but like, it was taking such a great toll on me to be in graduate school. And so I discovered I was about to drop out, and someone sent me a little bit of reading, a chapter from a book called Enforcing Normalcy. And it was by a disability studies scholar, Leonard Davis. I didn't know that disability studies was a thing at all at that point, which it had been for a long time, but I had no idea. And reading that, so that wasn't even like necessarily what we think of as a traditional storytelling. It was just like theory, but it felt deeply personal to me to read that literature. And so that prompt, that spark, having just a little bit of language and framework to think about how disability has been conceptualized, or the meaning that we put onto that experience, right?
Exactly.
As a culture, and sort of having a lens to analyze that differently or think about that differently completely changed me, like from the inside out. I mean, I've described it before. I think even in the book, I describe it. It felt like the physics of the world were changing around me in real time. Like the rules were changing, the way that this worked and how pieces fit together were changing. So I started writing at that point about my own experiences, because suddenly I had 27 years of memories to rethink and process. And I had a new awareness in the moments I was having in everyday life. So I was writing about memories. I was writing about current moments unfolding in real time. And I ended up starting an Instagram account because I wanted, like a few things. I had been writing essays that I was trying to publish in literary journals. And that's just a really slow process, right? You send things out and you wait months to hear back from someone when they may or may not want it. And there was something really immediate about publishing it in this little online space, and also interactive. Like I was getting to talk to people about these things and hear from other people. So I started writing there, and immediately floored that anyone cared at all about any of it. But I found so many other people with so many different kinds of I mean, like disabilities, but also just embodiments and like experiences in the world where they felt unseen or unknown or erased or stigmatized for things. Yeah. And so, yeah, like I started just devouring all of those stories in ways that were, I mean, it was like validating and seeing things that I thought this was literally, I thought I was the only person on the planet who like would get stopped by strangers to pray for their healing. You know, I thought I was the only person who got comments from people about how lucky I was that my boyfriend was with me, you know, like all of these things. Yeah. And so that was validating, but it was also really, really cool to hear people tell stories that were different than mine and, you know, like had different ways of thinking about living in their bodies. And that was challenging and interesting to me. Yeah, that was like, oh gosh, that was 2015, which I guess is like almost 8 years ago. Crazy. Crazy. It's so wild. But yeah, I found so many humans in that space that, I mean, like in very tangible ways changed my life. And like even now, I think especially in some ways, especially now that I've become a mom and being able to connect with other moms, specifically moms who use wheelchairs, but all like other moms with disabilities. I'm so grateful for it because what I've noticed from like the first minutes of becoming, like having my son with me, I was starting to tell a story about myself as a mom. Yeah. And it was not a kind story. And being able to have other moms who had an experience that was closer to mine than a mom who didn't use a wheelchair were able to like see those moments where what story I was writing and where and how, and help me reframe that in a point that felt really critical to me. And, you know, like I could feel myself writing this story in real time. Like I'm writing this story and I can see myself carrying this and into the future that I have with my son as he grows older, and to feel like, like to have the perspective of other stories of motherhood that resemble mine more has been huge for me. Honestly, I'm not sure that my son would exist if I hadn't seen moms in wheelchairs on Instagram. That sounds like a silly thing to say. Like, how could social media be that powerful? Do we want it to be that powerful? But it changed what I imagined for myself and what I imagined was possible in a really tangible way.
It's a great testament that it is no small thing to share our stories. And I would add to that to share our authentic stories, because I think you could have been seeing more kind of, I don't know, curated, shallow versions of people's stories. But if they started to share about the struggles or the things that they learn or the times that they, you know, they might be putting their story out knowing no one else has shared that story yet. And who's the first person to share that story? Like, sharing our stories and hearing other people's stories is no small thing. Like, I don't know if everybody, you know, has connected the dots in the way that you have to say, these stories were shared. I am different because of them now. Yeah. But whether people have connected the dots or not, I think that's happened to everybody, like in a good or bad way too, maybe like the stories that have shaped us, the stories that we've internalized that meant something to us could have been, you know, kind of hurtful or limiting to what we thought about ourselves too.
Yes. I think in particular, I mean, like, as we're talking about motherhood stories, I think that stories of motherhood are particularly fraught in that there is this right? Like there's so many layers to the idea that we have about what motherhood should look like, and wanting to emulate that, and then wanting to show the world that we're successful in that. And then just perpetuating this myth that motherhood is, I don't know, that like, there's this version of perfection that is possible or worth striving after that can be really harmful. And I think that the way that happens is also slippery, in that, like, I understand why moms don't necessarily want to like share the like harder moments of parenting in public spaces, because we're also very critical of moms, and you know, like,
you're gonna get obliterated,
scrutiny, and and especially for moms with disabilities, like I think it's very difficult to be honest about the thing. Like, as a mom with a disability, if you tell a story that includes something hard, you are in some ways validating the suspicions that people already have, is that you're not like you're giving evidence to say that you're right, I shouldn't have done this, as opposed to saying like, and disabled moms are just our moms in the whole scope of motherhood, and motherhood is hard, like,
yeah, right.
Anyhow, no. And to your point, yes, about like authentic stories, the person I'm thinking of the most, Alex Wegman, is a mom of 2. She has a disability that's similar to mine in that she uses a chair to get around. And the story I am specifically remembering that she shared before I found out I was pregnant, but was sort of trying to sort of begin to imagine what motherhood would look like for me. She told a story about being like in a neighborhood with some other parents, and her kid was learning to ride a bike in this, like, I think a cul-de-sac or something. And he like got with outside of her range of being able to like help him anymore. And another parent swooped in to help him, and how she was piecing together, like, there is a story in which you could tell that would be like, I'm an insufficient mom because I wasn't the one to swoop in at that moment. As opposed to, I am building this interdependent web of support for my kids, and it's wonderful that they are in this space where another parent, like something along those lines of like, how am I telling, what story are we on or in, right?
Absolutely. What's been a huge reframing for me upon like starting to do this podcast is just thinking about choice so much more, of like, there's a lot of things that we take for granted that we actually have a choice in. We have a choice in what we choose to believe about ourselves. If we are the incapable parent who's insufficient because you couldn't go help your son wherever, or the parent who's part of a community of other people, like whatever choice, which is also whatever story we're telling is in a way what meaning we're choosing. That's what she was doing. What am I making this moment mean? And again, we have choice in that. It's not, I have to think I'm an insufficient person as a mother because of these things. Like, you have choice in that. It's like lifting a veil to realize that like there's other ways to tell this story. I think the thing that has been the most pivotal for me in reframing motherhood so far is like in a conversation I had with Alex about when I was getting my son. It was this period where I was like learning how to get my son in the car seat and get him out of the car seat by myself, which is, like there's a different way of doing that as a mom who uses a wheelchair. And again, different, but not wrong.
There's a different, and I hadn't, like I don't have a lot of examples of seeing that. And so kind of figuring it out myself. And I would like go to people's houses, and they would come out to the car to greet us, and they would kind of just go to get my son out of the car seat and pull him out for me, which was really frustrating to me because I was working on this routine, and I wanted to be the one that was sort of the transition for him of like, now we're at this new space, and let me like bring you into this new space. And so I was like kind of like ranting and venting to Alex about that. I said something like, I can do it faster anyways. Like they're just like getting in the way of what I could do better, kind of thing. And Alex said, you know what, even if you didn't do it faster, you still get to do that. And so for me, that became this huge reframe in like the pace that my son's name is Otto, the pace that we have in the world. And so like we are the last people to leave the school parking lot every single day because we move really slowly, and I like lean into that. I relish that. That becomes like, we get to make eye contact. I pause to look at what he's holding in his hand. I do a little nose wiggle with him. Like we move slow. And I love that about us, as opposed to, and I think that the pressure that I would have felt on myself with a different story is like, all the other parents are moving so fast. They're out of the parking lot already. They're watching us move slow, and they think that I'm not doing a good job. Whatever that other alternate story is, of saying like, oh no, this is the story. The story is that we get to move slow, and we will, and we're going to be together and be present with each other in this different pace that doesn't match most of the parents around us. Anyways, just like has been so helpful for me to have to try to plant a different story. And that makes it, I don't know, like maybe that wording isn't what I like, because that makes it sound like I'm like inventing something. I think it's like seeing the different story in there, finding the other way to tell that actually aligns with my values, and that fits better with us. So works better for us.
I think another thing to question, which is just zooming out on this even further, is something that you're kind of talking about without talking about, and is kind of a undertone in your book too, is that we have a story. I'll, go ahead and say, like, in the United States, at least, like in our society, we have a story around self-sufficiency and moving quickly and efficiency and all of these things. And I'll say the perspective that I see it through is that what you say in your book is that people are looking at you and seeing weakness and helplessness. They're looking at you through a lens of pity. And again, those are not innate. They're choosing to attach that meaning to seeing you getting your son out of the car. And I think the stories around self-sufficiency and the idea that it is innately less desirable to need help in certain ways, like the mother and her son needing the other mother to support her, or, a number of different things. That's a story that has been told for generations. Yeah. And one of the, again, huge zoom out, but when I think about choice, I think about, like, historically, I guess there's things in our society that, like, you and I experience now that we do take for granted because they were choices that were made so long ago. We forget that they were a choice in the first place. Yeah. The choice to say, as a group, we're valuing self-sufficiency, we're valuing strength, we're valuing independence. They were choices, but those were choices that were made so long ago, we forget that they were a choice. And so it takes that extra bit of digging to say, okay, well, I can make a new choice about that overarching context, because we got a lot of contexts that affect us. Like, your family context affects the story that you tell about you, the generation that you grew up in and the media that you were seeing as a context, your community, your state, your country, whatever. And then also kind of on this very, very broad scale, that society story in a way. Yeah. And it's funny because funny is like not haha funny. It's interesting that, like, it's so much more instinctual or, like, automatic to assume that those are truths, not choices. Exactly. They feel like truths. They feel like, well, yeah, independence is better than dependence. But the thing that is also interesting to me about it, by the way, in sort of picking at, like, the narrative, the cultural narrative, it's interesting because you're right, we have that value of, like, independence is better than dependence. But it's so interesting to me what we focus on as independence and dependence, because, like, the mom who needs a support person there is depending on that person in some way. But, like, we also depend, I mean, like, we are not independent people in that, like, I don't know how to, like, most of us don't know how to fix our cars. We don't know how, right? Like, we don't know how to make clothes. We don't know how to, a lot of us don't mow our own lawns. Like, there's ways in which we practice interdependence or dependence in so many ways, but only some of them are stigmatized. Only some of them are the ones that we think of as weakness, and others are just, like, not even thought of, like, just not even thought of as interdependent. So that's an interesting part of it too. Like, you're, like, in making meaning, we are selective in, like, it seems like, in how we piece that together.
Okay, that is all for part 1 of our conversation with Rebekah, but you can join us again next Monday and the Monday after that for parts 2 and 3. We just couldn't stop talking when we recorded, so this one's a 3-parter. In the meantime, I'd encourage you to reflect on the questions that I posed at the top of the podcast description. They are: what does it mean to see yourself represented in stories? How can we find the courage to tell our stories, knowing that it matters for us to tell them? And then, what is the story that you want to tell about yourself? How is it different from the story the world is telling you? Another good next turn to take after this conversation is to check out Rebekah's book and her Instagram. Both are called Sitting Pretty. I just have nothing but good things to say about this book and Rebekah's storytelling in general, so I'm happy to point you in the direction of getting to know her and her story even better. As always, I'm supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolutions. This podcast is just one of the many initiatives that we do in order to be working towards those better social worlds that we're talking about. Plus, the music for Stories Lived, Stories Told is created and generously shared by Rick Spann, a member of the CMM Institute, and so a huge thank you to him as well. As far as podcast next turns go of what you can do, where you can go from here, it's always great if you can share this podcast. That's probably my biggest ask of you. Yes, you can like it and follow it, and those things are great. I always appreciate if you can leave a review, but really it means the most if you can be sharing these episodes, because that's what really keeps this conversation alive and invites more and more people in. So please share this episode, or maybe take some time to reflect on other episodes you've listened to, which ones were most meaningful to you, and who else in your life do you want to know about these episodes, and who do you want to bring into the conversation with you? Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told. Bye.